Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
So it sounds like Chauvin
Yes.
has just been convicted
92,
on all counts.
Yes.
The judge read it out. Second degree murder, guilty. Second count, third degree murder, guilty. Third count, second degree, I think it was manslaughter, guilty.
Will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury.
Yeah, so Chauvin has just been convicted on all charges. Look, I thought he was going to get convicted. I thought he was guilty of sin. And the reason I thought he was going to get convicted is because how could he not?
Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately, returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Chauvin's going to jail. The judge has revoked his bail. And there he is.
We're adjourned.
A convict. Derek Chauvin is guilty on all 3 counts. Second degree murder, third degree murder, guilty. Third count, second degree murder, I believe that was the manslaughter charge. Unintentional manslaughter, guilty. He was guilty on all 3 counts. Chauvin was guilty of sin. The argument that they were trying to basically make from the standpoint of the defense was that Chauvin acted reasonably. But how do you make that argument? If you want to make the case that says if Chauvin or if George Floyd is speaking, and by the very act of him speaking, that he can get wind out of his windpipe. The problem with that argument is, even if people give you that, even if they postulate that, which is not necessarily true, what happens when he stops? How do you explain that? How do you explain going beyond the point where he stops, when the paramedic shows up, and a minute and a half after the paramedic shows up, you still have your knee on a man's throat? It wasn't like he was fighting you at that point. It wasn't like he was pushing back or having any pressure or any resistance. You kept your knee on that man's throat, an aggressive act. And the defense attorney was like, well, he could have punched him and kicked him and did all of that stuff. And because he didn't punch him and kick him and hit him with elbows, then that was indicative of the fact that he wasn't trying to kill him. I don't care what he was trying to do. I care what is something that a reasonable cop, or that the expectation of a reasonable cop, and it is not to use overwhelming force. While an individual is already in a position where he is pleading and begging for his life and telling you that he can't breathe, you murdered him. And the cops, in this point, cut bait. I think the worst case or worst aspect of this is that the argument that the prosecutor made was that Chauvin was a bad apple. He wasn't a bad apple. He is a bad apple, but the entire batch is bad. It's not just him as an individual. Those cops were there with Chauvin, and none of them saw Chauvin as doing anything wrong. They saw, with a knee on his throat, Chauvin did that day in, day out, the entirety of the year, the entirety of the career. And he probably saw nothing wrong with it at all. That was just typical policing in the way typical policing went. It's just in that one specific instance that typical policing got caught. Murdered a man. Gruesomely murdered a man. For 9 minutes, had her knee on that man's throat, with that man and life oozing out of that man moment by moment by moment, where he knew his life was going to be forfeit. And not necessarily for anything that he was doing wrong at that point. Because at that point, he was subdued. At that point, he had already been broken. At that point, there was nothing else that he could do but lay there and die at the hands of Chauvin. Chauvin murdered a man with his bare hands. And I'm being literal with that. And the entire world, including Floyd's family, got to watch him in gruesome detail and painstaking moment by painstaking moment have the life ripped out of him by a man that didn't give a shit about his life or the value of his life. This is what's taking place right now outside. Guilty on all counts. Just to be clear, there is no justice here. There's no justice in this. I understand that people wanted to prosecute it. They wanted to prosecute it because he killed multiple people. But the fact that he gets prosecuted is not justice in and of itself. You need to understand the difference in those things. I know that people sometimes conflate the two. Hey, justice was served. What justice was served? From a societal standpoint, a person who killed somebody got put into prison. That's necessary in order to keep some level of societal cohesion, because otherwise people will start taking matters into their own hands. Or for that matter, the protests trying to force the state to behave appropriately in regards to the different racial demographics and to have value for the life. If a person's life is killed or taken and there's no consequence, did the life have value? Meaning when Tamir Rice was wiped away, did Tamir's life have value? To the family, yes. To the society, clearly not. If it had value from the context of the society, then the cop would have been prosecuted because the cop would have done something that was monstrous from the perspective of the society. You murdered a child. In this very specific case, you have an adult that was killed and destroyed, and the state, with a heaping of scorn and a heaping of all sorts of intention, convicted the person who did that gruesome murder. But is that justice? Does it balance the scales from the standpoint of the family members? Does it balance the scales from the mom, from the friends, from the cousins, from the people that were around that particular person? And despite that person having a bad day, that is not the encapsulation of his life. That is not necessarily the relationship that he had with the people around him. And those people would never be made whole. It is impossible for any of us to make those people whole. The only thing that will make those people whole is if that person continued to exist, or something to stop it from happening again. And even then, it's not making them whole. It's just giving them some peace of mind that this is not going to befall somebody else. They don't get that peace of mind. This will befall somebody else. In the middle of the trial, you just had a 13-year-old that got shot by a cop, and you had another 20-year-old that just got shot by a cop. Yeah, they don't get that peace of mind. They don't get the feeling that this won't happen again. They know it's going to happen again. They know that ultimately Chauvin, despite being called a bad apple, is part of a bad batch. And ultimately, the only thing they can get out of this is the punitive prosecution of Chauvin. Chauvin is found guilty on all counts. At the very least, that happened. Yeah. Look, cops kill 1,000 people a year. And in the context of 1,000 people a year dying, I mean, that number is so monstrous. And that number is only made worse when you know that 1% of those are charged. Or 1% get prosecuted. Even within the context of the 1% that get prosecuted, only 33% go to jail. Chauvin is an outlier. But Chauvin is an outlier because of how gruesome it was. And there are two things that are at work here. One, you can watch the video and you can see that the defense attorney is out of his depth in trying to explain this. I mean, you're trying to explain that it's rational to put a knee on a man's throat and keep that knee on a man's throat even after the person goes unconscious, and even after the paramedics get there, and even a minute after the paramedics get there. And you're trying to say that's reasonable policing because at any moment he could have just popped up and ripped off the... starts running away. Radically unreasonable. So that argument fell flat. But you also have the second esoteric other that's lingering in the jury pool. When the verdict came back that fast, I was like, oh, he's toast. He's guilty. He's sin. They didn't have to overly think about it. He was guilty of sin. You couldn't confuse the issue. What they also knew, though, is that if they came back with a verdict that allowed him to go, that city was going to be set on fire tonight. That city may still be set on fire tonight. But at the very least, they prosecuted. And I would imagine each one of them, whether they said anything to one another or not, full well understood that either I do this or there will be consequences. Now, I don't believe for a moment that the reason that they convicted him was because of that. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring up that that had to be an aspect of their thinking in that room. But that said, Chauvin was guilty of sin. You can watch it on video yourself. There was no there beyond what was taking place in that video. One man physically murdered another man with other people watching, including people that were supposed to actually protect that guy. George Floyd paid tax dollars to the cop that ended up murdering him. Like, share, and subscribe. Yeah, there was no overdose. There was no overdose. The medical examiner is very clear on how he died. In fact, the medical examiner and the other examiner that the family got were very clear. It had nothing to do with the drugs or nothing to do with drugs in the system. It had everything to do with one man physically putting another man down and putting his knee on his throat for 9 minutes. That's the thing that ends up killing him. The examiner that got on the stand said as much. It was very clear that Floyd died as a result of Chauvin. No more, no less. Anybody saying otherwise is a goddamn liar. Like, share, and subscribe.